When people say the dollar was crowned, nobody crowned it. It was forced into a role which it didn't want to play. See, the entire world is directly hitched to the US. 60% of central banking reserves are the dollar. Roughly 90% of global trade is invoiced in the dollar. Dollar is literally tied into this thing. As things stand, US has roughly $35 trillion of debt.
A $34 trillion debt bomb growing bigger by the day and causing global anxiety.
That's a massive number. What happens if US government doesn't pay it back?
If the US debt ever becomes a problem, the world is burning down anyway.
That's the last problem of us. That means there's going to be fire and smoke outside our home.
The blood oaths that created Chinese capitalism.
What are we talking about? A Kannada serial?
This is a show that's explicitly meant to waste your time. Do not look at us for investment advice. We will not help your portfolio. But the one thing that we do is that we will make a case. And the case is this. As much as learning about businesses, economies, markets, etc. is good for your portfolio, there is another reason to do it. And that is that it is just so much fun. I'm Pranav, this is Bhuvan. And I think we are behind most of the things that you see on the Markets channel. And one thing that we have in common is that we are absolutely fascinated by the world, right? And the one thing that happens when you're fascinated by the world is that you just find yourself almost obsessively sort of reading about things, learning about things. You learn something, you find that you're fascinated, you go a little further, you're even more fascinated, you go even further, you're even more fascinated, and suddenly, a few hours later, you find that you have 36 different tabs open on your browser. You are on a Wikipedia page that you do not recognize at all. And you, for the last couple of hours, have had so much fun that you can't describe it. You are, in short, in a rabbit hole. So in this show, what we're going to do is we're going to take you down some of the rabbit holes that we have landed up in over the last couple of weeks of our research. And that's all that is.
Okay, I just want to add something to it. We're not experts. If you want expert opinions on the things that we are going to talk about, I'm 100% sure there are more authoritative sources. But having said that, every expert goes through a journey of learning something. And in between that weird period where somebody knows something and doesn't know something, there is a sweet spot where people are okay looking like idiots. Basically, people are comfortable looking dumb. And the bigger problem with most of the content, at least we see, is I think that it's become an afterthought. People want to really look like experts, etc. We are not. Having said that, I'm comfortable saying that I'm the world's biggest idiot when it comes to learning things. And if you want to get a sense of how a person who's like a self-confessed dumbass goes about learning a new topic, you'll get a sense about it. So in a way, we're more or less in the same place where people listen to us. So what's your first rabbit hole?
So my first rabbit hole is the story of how a week's bad weather in Germany led to the collapse of the Norwegian government.
Not shocking at all. Go ahead.
Okay, so, I mean, everybody knows that Europe is leading the charge in renewables, right?
Right.
If you look at Germany's energy mix right now, something like 1/3 of all their electricity is coming from wind energy. Another 14-15% comes from solar energy.
I think the caveat is the European power system, it's more market-driven. So power prices are traded. People's power bills are not the same as they are in India. Our power bills are heavily subsidized by almost bankrupt discoms. So there it's different. So continue.
Yeah. So the only problem with having almost 50% of your electricity come from the wind or the sun is what happens if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, right? You're supposed to have backups for such a situation when you're doing the planning.
Right.
So one of the backups that Germany had was nuclear power. Okay. I think if you want to actually understand the politics of a place, you need to understand the emotion of it all, right? So if you think about Germany's emotional relationship with nuclear power has been extremely fraught.
Right.
So think of being a German person in the 1970s, right? Your country's produced Hitler. He's been a black stain on the soul of your country. You sort of, you're absolutely ashamed that period happened in your history. And if you look around the world, you have the US, the Soviets, both of them are going absolutely gung-ho on nuclear power, right? So nuclear in your head is sort of a sign of this statist militarist project. And in that era, the ethic that Germany develops is this very sort of grassroots, almost like a return to the soil sort of ethic in people. And people are sort of constantly protesting about things. There is an environmental backlash in the 1970s against like nuclear power, etc.
That explains the rise of their Green Party.
And then, like, fast forward another 15 years, when Chernobyl happens, for us, it's a far-off thing that happened because of Soviet incompetence. We're like, it doesn't even matter. But for Germany, right, it's Germany, Poland, Ukraine. They're like right there. In Bavaria, apparently, for weeks after Chernobyl, there were rains that sort of got nuclear particles everywhere. Apparently, you still are recommended to not eat too many Bavarian mushrooms. Because
You'll become Spider-Man.
so, like, they have this sort of deep-seated distrust of nuclear power. Yeah. So, after Fukushima happens in 2011, the German government says, hey, we are done with nuclear. We have a bunch of nuclear power plants, but we're going to shut them down. I think we can just do with other stuff. The one good thing that they have is they have lots and lots of natural gas to sort of get them through to a green future, right? And the biggest sort of source of that natural gas is Russia. And then 2022 rolls around and even that goes off, right? So now Europe is already in this horrible spot. European energy prices are something like 4 to 5x what people pay in the United States. Something like 5 to 7x what we pay here in India. So it's just absolutely, it's extremely expensive as it is. And then the risk remains that one fine day the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow.
That's not something. I don't think I would have said that sentence in the context of something market related.
So, Germany has this sort of weather phenomenon called the Dunkelflaute.
I will pretend like I can pronounce it.
I mean, I can't pronounce it either. So, the Dunkelflaute is this, it's like direct translation is, I think, dark doldrums. Or basically like a dark windless time.
It sounds very ominous.
So for like a week, 2 weeks, and this happens like a couple of times a year. Like for a week or 2 weeks, suddenly there are like these skies become extremely gray, extremally cloudy, but there is no wind whatsoever. And like that just completely wrecks their energy system.
Yeah, as I can imagine. Also sounds like a very foreboding sign. Like the calm before the end of the world, something like that.
So in December 2024, they had like a horrible Dunkelflaute. Right. Energy prices suddenly went up like 14x the average.
Yeah.
And so that's already a problem. But this is a Germany problem, right? So why is Norway being pulled into this question? The thing is that in Europe, like all of their national grids are interconnected. Right. And they're stitched together. There are like sort of 3 super grids on Europe, and they're also all connected to each other. So basically, when there is an energy problem in one part of Europe, there is an energy problem everywhere else in Europe.
Right.
So for a week when Germany can't produce basically half its electricity, Germany starts drawing electricity from everywhere else in Europe. So you have price surges everywhere from sort of Netherlands to Norway.
I don't remember reading about this at all. It's very surprising. So everybody gets pulled into this mess.
Sort of, yeah. So basically, it's a single energy market. So energy flows where the prices are high. So until prices equalize, everyone's screwed. On top of that, their other fallback alternative is to run their gas power plants, right. Which means that they're suddenly importing lots and lots of gas, and that gas is coming from Norway. Now, to come to the other character in the story, right? So Norway is something that most people don't know is that Norway has been going on renewables for almost the last century.
Yeah.
So Norway basically has lots of mountains, lots and lots of water.
Hydropower.
So they've just created these massive dams. That's a source of idle energy. Whenever they have excess energy, they just take water and pump it back up. So it also is sort of like a huge pumped water storage sort of system. So I think in Europe's greatest fever dreams, Norway is sort of a battery for the rest of Europe. So Europe will do the transition, and then when things are bad, Norway will provide everyone with power.
Yeah, the backup.
Obviously, Norway does not like this. Norway is a huge energy exporter. Like a lot of their idle keeps going to Europe. That means that Norway's own prices are high.
Right.
Now, for a while, the Norwegians tried to manage this whole situation, right? So they said that, hey, we are going to go Norway first. We will supply our guys with energy. If we have anything left, then you can take it over. We will keep our prices capped to X. Then you can take energy, etc.
Sounds like make Norway great again.
But then, Europe starts being Europe, right? So Europe has a lot of these energy single market laws, and there's this new set of 3 directives that they come out with. And those directives are basically pushing people to, they interfere with everything from building codes to like what certificates businesses need to buy in order to sort of purchase electricity, to sort of everything else. What percentage of your country's energy mix has to be in renewables, all sorts of things, right? And as all of you probably know, like half of Europe hates Europe right now anyway. And all of these projects, like, now just sort of seem like overly, bombastic, overly draconian, overly like bureaucratic.
Classic Europe.
So Norway is not like technically part of EU, but Europe is, so Norway is sort of trying to get into the EU energy single market. But Europe is like, hey, if you want to get into this market, you have to follow all of these laws. Now, Norway has this coalition government. The coalition government has this Labour Party, and it has a centrist party. The Labour Party is basically like a labour rights first party with sort of pro-EU leanings. The centrist party is Eurosceptic.
Interesting.
So there is this tussle going on within the Norwegian government on like, hey, why does Europe tell us what to do? Who is Europe to sort of determine how we are doing things? We have been doing this for a century. You came here yesterday. Who are you to tell me like what percentage of renewables, etc.? Right. So this is already like a very tense situation. And then the Dunkelflaute comes, Europe's energy prices spike. Within 1 week, electricity prices in Norway suddenly go 20x.
Ouch. Ouch.
The Norway energy minister, who is from the Labour Party, which is the pro-Europe party, literally goes to the press and says, this is a very shit situation.
A man after my own heart. I admire his choice of words.
And so there is a January 17th deadline or something for Norway to sign on to all the EU directives.
24 or 25? Sorry, 25 or 26?
And like it was already sort of a very tense situation. And then suddenly your energy prices spiked. And the centrists just said, hey, we are not part of this. They fall off the government. So now Norway has this extreme minority government. The prime minister is still from the Labour Party. The cabinet is still from the Labour Party, but they only have 26% of the seats or something like that.
So it's like a delicate balance now.
So basically they have the executive but not the legislature, so they can't.
So what's the status of this fight now?
So Labour is still trying to get on to the EU energy directives. I think there is this constant like fight in Europe everywhere where there is a side of the political spectrum that, wants to, come around the lightning rod that is Europe in a time which is sort of extremely uncertain. And then there is a side to the political spectrum everywhere in Europe where they're like, these guys are horrible bureaucrats and we don't want anything to do with them. And I think obviously the Labour Party is from the prior side, so they're still trying to push everyone towards Europe. But
Europe sounds like that. Like you remember if there's a family gathering where you bloody hate all relatives, but you just grin and make, look nice in front of your relatives just to put up with them. This reminds me of that. So when the natural gas thing happened, so they were entirely dependent on Russian natural gas. Russia cut it off, and Europe. Actually, Russia didn't cut it off. Europe said we are going to stop taking. Weirdly, there's I think 10 or 15% of the gas still comes from Russia. Mother of all ironies. Apparently, they started stealing gas from Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. I remember. So it was complete blackouts. They said we are not going to use Russian natural gas, but they had to make up the shortfall somehow. So ironically, Norway was the savior even in that case, because Norway is one of the largest producers of oil in the world, which most people don't know. So natural gas comes from this thing. So eventually, US and Norway, if I remember correctly, made up the entire shortfall of the Russian gas supply. The second thing is in between that adjustment period, so they still needed a lot of gas to power up their gas-fired plants. So for the past decade or so, apparently Pakistan had spent a lot of money trying to green up its grid by going to natural gas. So shit hits the fan. So Europe tells the suppliers, you default on the contract, we'll more than cover up the legal costs plus the gas prices. You just, like midway, turn the ship around mid-ocean, the LNG tankers, just come and deliver it to Europe. And for the next, I think it probably is still happening. Like I haven't read the latest, but Pakistan had the largest blackouts in the history of blackouts. Same applies to Bangladesh. Weirdly, Pakistan, when you're pushed against the wall, you end up doing something. So they started importing, small solar panels from China. So I think Pakistan had individual households have installed more solar panels than I think roughly half of the entire national grid capacity or something like that. In a weird way, things ended up working out, but it goes to show just how messy this entire system is. It's more like held together with duct tapes and hairpins.
Yeah, I think the green transition is every problem all at once. It's a scientific problem. It's a political problem.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. Okay, so that's your rabbit hole?
That's my first rabbit hole, yeah.
Okay, so my rabbit hole is US debt. So for as long as I've followed the markets, in fact, it's been happening much longer than that. For as long as I've followed the markets, people have been screaming that the US is going to default on its debt. Why? Because today, as things stand, US has roughly $35 trillion of debt. That's a massive number. To put that into context, US debt is equivalent to US's GDP. Seems bad. But when we were doing the book club, you asked, you asked a question, okay, where is the tipping point? When does this become bad? When does this massive debt become bad? So before that, I think the thing you need to know about like a debt, so there is US and there are other countries. So the same frame of thinking you used to think about US debt, US assets doesn't apply to the other countries, because US is the most powerful country on the planet, the largest economy, the most liquid markets. They're also the issuer of the reserve currency of the entire world, which is the dollar. So the same constraints which apply to US doesn't really apply to the rest of the world. So the very first thing you need to think about is US is the exception, not the norm. So the same constraints don't apply to, technically speaking, US has very little constraints. But whatever logic you used to think about US debt, US assets doesn't really apply to the rest of the world, including most advanced countries and also especially emerging countries. With that said, debt is a very emotional word. It's a very, very filthy word, because debt implies an obligation to pay back. And when you have to pay back something, you don't feel good about it, because in a way it feels like you have less. So the very first mistake people make about thinking about US debt in particular is that they assume that government is a household. So you are a household, you borrow 1 lakh from the bank, you're supposed to pay it back. Not supposed, you have to pay it back. If not, you'll get dragged to the court, something will happen. So which means, but if you take the same logic and superimpose it on a government, the logic doesn't hold, because a government has indefinite planning horizons, which means it also can tax people. You can't tax your relatives to take money and then pay back the loan. It doesn't work. You can, but you're going to get punched in the face. Then the US government can also print its own money. So this concept of printing trips up a lot of people, but we'll set that aside forever. It's not really worth getting into. What does printing mean? Think of it in a very abstract sense. The government has the ability to create ones and zeros. So printing necessarily doesn't mean printing physical coins and money and somebody will put it in a briefcase and send it to the bondholders of US Treasuries. Forget that. Ones and zeros are created. It's sent to the other guy. His bond is made good. So tomorrow, if US government wants to wake up and say, I want $1 trillion, there'll be 1 trillion ones and zeros created. It's good. So that's, in a very loose sense, that's what people confuse with money printing. But let's set that aside. I don't think it's worth getting into for a variety of reasons. So now, as things stand, there's roughly $35 trillion of debt. And people have been screaming that this is a lot of money. What happens if US government doesn't pay it back? Or what happens if there's a point where some shock happens and there is a debt default? But this has a very apocalyptic sounding framing to it because $35 trillion is a massive amount of money. It's the same size as the entire US GDP, and US is spending close to $1.5 trillion on interest payments. Our entire bloody GDP is not even $3.5 trillion. So US pays 30% of India's GDP as interest payments every year. It spends more on interest payments than military, which we wrote about recently, on, I think, healthcare, education, something else put together. So US interest payments are one of the biggest components of this thing. And the second biggest component of spending is essentially automatic spending, Medicare, social services, etc., which is enshrined in the law. This spending automatically happens. Now, this has become a talking point because Elon and his merry band of idiots have been running around saying that, they're saying a lot of dumb shit which is not worth really getting into. But suddenly, US debt has become part of the talking point. It always is, but now these people have blown it out of proportion, saying that this is a massive amount of money. US is on its way to becoming Rome. Things will blow up in our face. Our republic will end. But I think this is blown out of proportion. See, the very first thing, like I said, the US government is not the household, which means US can print its money, can always make good its debt. So there is no constraint on the US government not paying it back. Even before, let's assume there's a hyperinflation constraint, because if you print enough money, you'll become Zimbabwe. Even before that, the US government still has the ability to tax people. The irony is US is one of the lowest tax countries in OECD. So technically, if the US government wants to start shrinking its budget, it can start taxing its people a lot more. Whether it will do it or not, let's set that aside. And the other thing is debt to GDP the right metric to think about debt? Because it's a proportion of your GDP. Okay, let's flip it. So what if you look at debt to assets? So the US, because a country is like a balance sheet. There is an asset side and there's a balance sheet. So before I get to that, so think about US debt. It's roughly $35 trillion. US household wealth is $160 trillion. So now is it really bad? Suddenly it becomes different. Now you also have, so this entire debate is also polluted by ideology. If you're a conservative, right-wing oriented person, debt is the worst thing to you. It's Satan, it's an abomination, it's bloody fire and brimstone, it's apocalypse, everything. It's bad.
Before we get into that though, so this is household assets versus debt on the books of the federal government. And the state governments also, or just the federal?
Everything put together is $35 trillion. Now, I'll break that out also. Here's the other thing. Thanks for bringing that up. So if you remove the debt on government's books, because after 2008, the government started doing quantitative easing, etc. So a chunk of the government bonds are on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve itself. So in a way, Federal Reserve owes money to itself. So if you, because Federal Reserve, so the Treasury issues bonds whenever it needs to raise money. And after 2008, when, for a variety of reasons, the Federal Reserve started buying the bonds in an indirect way to influence interest rates. So the government bought back its own bonds. The RBI also does it through...
So the Treasury releases bonds and the Federal Reserve...
buys it. Yeah. So they are like the two arms of the same state. So ideally, there should be one, but let's not get into that. So if you remove the debt component held by the Federal Reserve, the US government, the state government, etc., the debt to GDP from roughly about 120% falls to 80%. So $35 trillion, I think, out of which $28 trillion is held by public. So you can think of this as debt at risk, which is This is held by private actors, both US citizens, foreign governments, let's say private investment funds, everything put in. Because these are the people who care about debt in a theoretical sense. The Federal Reserve, which owns its own debt, doesn't really care about its debt. And there's also no risk of the federal government selling its own debt into the open market. So now suddenly we went from 120% of debt to GDP to 80% GDP. Is that bad?
So hypothetically, like, what happens if the Treasury defaults to the Fed? Like, is there any?
No.
Even if, let's say, Jerome Powell and Scott Bessent hate each other and start fighting, is there no risk of even like some sort of political backlash? Is anything happening?
So that's where we get into it. Now, these are the numbers. Now, before I get to the point, the other thing people should also know is, completing that ideology point. So if you're on the left of the spectrum, debt suddenly becomes less of a boogeyman. So the thing about debt is like, before I get to the risk point, you need to know that there is good debt and bad debt. The inverse of that is there is good risk and bad risk, which is to say that is running a balanced budget always good? Not necessarily. So that's the household thinking. Because a government is not a household. Government always spends more than it receives because the spending needs might be such. Like in the time of war, can you run a balanced budget? Absolutely not. The last time we had the same level of deficits in the advanced countries was during World War II. So assume that during World War II, the US had tried to balance the budget. This recording wouldn't be happening. In your conversation, we wouldn't be talking about Duncan Floyd. Duncan Floyd out with the entire world right now. Same logic applies to pandemic. So pandemic hit, the entire global economy shut down. Should the government be worried about deficits, or should the government be worried about the survival of human race? So there are genuine cases where the government has to spend. But the thing is, like historically, there have been instances after World War II when US debt to GDP crossed 120, 130%, whatever it is. In the next 30 years, the debt came down. How they did it, we'll get to it later, but it came down. So there have been instances throughout UK has the longest bond market history. So there have been instances where the UK government has paid back its debt in some sense. Which brings me to the payback part. So government has $35 trillion of debt. So that's a liability in a sense. But we live in a world where everything is a balance sheet. We live in a double entry world. Your liability is somebody else's asset. So the government's $35 trillion of debt is the private sector's asset. So what do I mean by that? If you are a government issuing a bond, it's a liability for you. But if I'm an individual investor investing in a government bond fund, it's my asset. So in this case, is debt good or bad?
How much of the debt is owed to people outside the US?
So China and roughly 15 to 17%. So China owns close to $1 trillion and Japan owns close to $1.5 trillion. So it's a small component. It's just, so out of the $35 trillion, roughly $2 trillion are held by this thing. And then Germany has some $600 to $700 billion, the Eurozone countries, India has this thing, which leads to the other point. The US government bonds, or in a very abstract sense, the dollar, is the safest asset for the entire world. So there was a funny saying when I was initially started learning about the market. US exports two things, trash and treasuries. So the predominant export of US is treasuries. So this goes back to our favorite economist, Michael Pettis. So is the US running deficits out of willingness or unwillingness? So Pettis says, as long as somebody has a surplus, so in this case, we're talking about China, Japan, Korea, etc. These are surplus countries. Somebody has to accommodate the surplus. There has to be a corresponding deficit. So he says this is mechanical. US is not running it out of its good heart. It's just ultimately all surpluses and deficits have to balance. So this is how the balancing happens. There are other people who say that necessarily doesn't mean the case. If US wants to tomorrow shut down its deficit, it technically can. Like it can slash social security spending, Medicaid, raise taxes, suddenly stop making investments. Even at the risk of people dying out of hunger, it can balance its book. So there is no answer to it. The reason why I brought ideology into it is because that predominantly colors the answer you get out of this. There are also a lot of, so the other point I want to introduce is complicating factors. There's a new theory called modern monetary theory. So this has been around for a long time. The original creator, if I remember correctly, is this person called Warren Mosler. So who said that if you're a sovereign who issues your own currency, deficits are an irrelevant factor because you can print your own currency, but everything has to have a constraint. So what's the constraint? Until and unless inflation becomes a risk, you can have infinite amount of debt, infinite amount of deficits. It doesn't really matter. The only complicating factor is...
So is there a one-to-one mechanical relationship between deficits and inflation, or is it that some kind of government spending creates more inflation, some kind of government spending creates less inflation?
So it becomes a little tricky. So technically, if you borrow too much money and then suddenly force it all into the real economy in terms of spending, there is a limit where not only does debt become bad, and by the way, nobody knows that limit. So I've heard, I think that Wharton has this budget model which said that 200% of debt to GDP is the magic number where US deficits blow out of proportion, and all the investors suddenly start saying that we'll no longer buy US treasuries and we'll start dumping it in the open market. But nobody knows. It's just people have been drawing the line on the sense. So there's an entity called Congressional Budget Office, CBO. So they are like a non-partisan entity which analyzes government finances. They said, and quote, "We have no clue where the line where this thing blows out of proportion is." So even the bloody government doesn't know. So coming back to your point, so during COVID, so the US government, again, printed, we'll not get into it, roughly $6 trillion. So what do we mean by printed? The Treasury printed bonds. Treasury issued the bonds. Somebody bought the bonds. The money went to Treasury's account, and Treasury roughly spent, I think, $5 trillion directly crediting the money into the hands of, into the bank accounts of government people. There was inflation. Now, it's hard to disentangle what percentage of inflation can be attributed to government spending versus what level of inflation can be attributed to the idiosyncrasies of COVID, because there was supply chains crisis. There was both a demand shock and a supply shock, and in between those, the adjustment of two forces, inflation suddenly rose.
So lots of people had money, but nobody was selling stuff.
Yes, because everybody was ordering Amazon, but the stuff had to come from somewhere. There were no boats, there were no containers, factories had shut down, people had died, there was labor shortages. Dude, there was everything shortage, like literally everything shortage, because I was following the supply chain crisis. So there is a real risk of inflation. And even though the MMT guys said that government can run unlimited deficits, some people who hate MMTers say that the fact that during COVID you had inflation is proof that your bloody theory is wrong and it's just make-believe.
Is it possible that in a non-COVID world, you could give out $600 stimulus checks and you would just grow the economy a lot, but because you can set up factories quickly and do production, nothing happens?
I don't think so, because it's easier to give money than build a factory. So in between the time that money hits the factory, it takes 2 seconds for the money to be credited. It takes at least 2 years for a factory to be created. So when there is a lot of money suddenly in the system searching for outlets to go, and if the system is not able to accommodate, you will obviously have inflation, which is a real risk. So the people who have been crying about US deficits, $30 trillion of debt, which is their point, which is to say that you are crowding out public investment, and the fact that you as a government are shoving so much money into the system will essentially create inflationary this thing. So in a loose sense, $30 trillion, $300 trillion, that doesn't really matter.
What matters is how many people can sell.
And what matters is, will you really spark inflation? There is, in some loose sense, there's an equilibrium point at which debt becomes bad. We have no idea where that point is.
So there's that Morgan-Housel idea, right? That debt basically constrains the range of possibilities you can survive. So let's say there is a hypothetical like World War III. What happens? Like, what are the range of possibilities that the US can't survive with a very, very high debt?
This is a good point. So, if I were to invert your question, you are asking, what stops this party? So, roughly, here's the shocking part. Roughly, if you assume US is roughly 300 years old or something like that, in a very loose sense, don't quote me on this number. For 99% of US's history, it's run a deficit. There have been only 4 Bill Clinton years when there was a primary surplus.
Wasn't there a surplus until the 1900s?
US has run persistent deficits for literally 90% of its existence. The same applies to a lot of other countries also, including UK. So this deficit's not really a bad thing. To me, it seems like a natural state of being, because you as a government are automatically front-running the needs of your civilization. So which means you'll obviously spend more than you tax. Unless you're China or unless you're maybe Germany. But even those models quickly fall apart, as we are right now seeing. So Before that, can you pay back debt? Technically, yes. So Jamaica had, by the way, that's a rare case. So there have been very few countries, you can count on the number of hands, which have paid back the debt. And also, before we get into the shocks, I think we need to explain to people what paying back debt means. See, if you are an individual and you have borrowed money, you have to pay back debt. But a government will never pay back debt. It's impossible. What do I mean by that? Your debt is an asset. So for the government to pay back $35 trillion of debt means $35 trillion worth of assets have to be extinguished.
But, I mean, it'll just go into cash, right?
No. If you pay back a liability to a bank, that money is gone. It's extinguished. Asset,
From the system.
asset is a liability. It is removed. So that means, so the debt is on government's book. The assets is on private sector's book. The private sector will be poorer by $35 trillion. So that's what people don't get it. They always look at debt in an isolation and don't really look at the asset side of the balance sheet. This is, at least to my extent, if I can say that the modern monetary theory guys are right. So what they do is they invert government deficits. They show it as private sector surplus. Now suddenly debt seems a little scary because it's the wealth of your own private sector. It's the wealth of your own people. It's the investments of your own people. And the second thing is, this is something, by the way, going back to the intro where I said I'm still learning about it, this is one thing I am unclear about. So let's say the US government pays back debt. It's running one-to-one surplus, or rather the budget is balanced. For every dollar of deficits, there's a dollar of surplus. The books are balanced. Now, you are a private individual. You're working in a company. You earned $1. Now, let's say out of that, 60 cents goes to equity. 30 cents has to go to something safer if you follow the traditional portfolio diversification benefit. Okay, where will the 30 cents go? Because your government is now running balanced budgets. It's not issuing debt. Okay, where will you put your 30 cents? What's the safe asset you'll put it in?
Corporate bonds, I don't know.
So the government, so the German case is a classic example. So the reason why US is accommodating these deficits is because there is a thing called as a safe asset. So there's this person called Gary Gerstle. He's a well-known economist. He wrote a paper saying that the entirety of history of humanity is a search for a safe asset. We went through rocks, we went through cowrie shells, we went through gold, we went through silver, fucking paper notes, everything, all to figure out one place, one asset, one thing to safely store our money. So in the modern financial system as we know it, government debt has come to occupy that position. Which now suddenly if you think about that, government debt is a store of value. Suddenly this debt seems like a less of a problem because you need a safe asset. In a system where money is being intermediated, before the money goes from point A to point B, there has to be a safe store of value somewhere. It could be a bank, but ultimately banks' money has to be denominated in something.
So help me understand this. Let's say like 25 years down the line, the US dollar is still a safe asset, but it's not, the sort of it's not the reserve currency. There are, let's say, 5 reserve currencies.
Right.
Let's say apart from the dollar, there's also yen, yuan, whatever. So there, like the rest of the world is not rushing at the same pace to sort of buy US bonds. Does this power recede or like how does it work?
So what we do know is if you take a very long sweep of history, like let's say 1,000, 2,000 years, currencies have always, the pecking order has always changed. So prior to the dollar, I don't know the full history, but the pound sterling was the predominant currency. So on the eve of World War I, the power was already receding because the British Empire was disintegrating, plus Britain had heavy bills to pay for World War I, which was immediately followed by World War II, and Britain became a former shadow of itself. So in a loose sense, you can say that a country's economic heft is, in a loose sense, proportional to the acceptance of its currency and debt as a safe asset. So after World War II, US emerged as the victor. It was the only superpower left, which meant that it was the only large country who could literally not default on anything. So the US, it's like a historical relay race. So Britain handed over the baton to US and US has been running ever since. Can this change? So again, if you take the long sweep of history, so the US, as things stand today, roughly don't hold me to the number, roughly 60% of the central banking reserves held by all the other central banks are held in US dollars. At one point, I think that was 80%. So after the rise of euro, after the rise of renminbi, after the rise of, let's say, Australian dollar, Korean won, Swiss franc, Japanese yen, the dollar share of reserves held by all the central banks, let's say all the private actors, has fallen a little. But it's still half of a large pie. Now, why did the other countries, other private actors start preferring non-dollar assets? So one, of course, the easy answer is markets became liquid. These currencies were also issued by advanced countries. They were relatively safer compared to, let's say, I don't know, Namibia or Chad. It's not US, but it's not Namibia either. So these assets are safer. The global FX markets, bond markets became liquid, so you could park somewhere up there. The second logic, and this I heard from this, if I remember correctly, is a Cornell professor called Iswar Prasad. He wrote a pretty decent book also called, I think, Future of the Money. So he made this point that it's not so much as countries moving away from the dollar. It's just that if you're a central bank, would you want all your eggs in the same basket? You're just diversifying it. So you are buying Korean won, not because Korea is the new US, it's just a diversification imperative. This is not a reflection on the dollar's decline. Many people have called dollars decline over the years when dollar has persistently stuck around. What stops this baby? Or how can it, this thing is the question. We don't know, but there are a range of possibilities. March 2020, COVID happens, the world shuts down. If you are a company, you have no business, but you still have to make payroll. You suddenly start selling all your assets to hold on to cash. You're an individual employee. You have no job prospects because you have no idea your paycheck is going to come from. You start selling your investments to hold on to cash. Everybody suddenly is moving to cash because there is so much uncertainty, nobody knows what tomorrow will look like. But for people to hold cash, it will always be held in something. It could be fixed deposits, it could be bonds, gold, mutual funds, whatever it is. There was an episode called Dash for Cash. So suddenly people started dumping so much assets into the market couldn't hold. And one of the biggest assets held is the US Treasury bond because it's the safest asset in the entire history in terms of pecking order. Suddenly liquidity vanished from the US Treasury market. So even the US Treasury market, despite it being the issuer of a reserve currency of the world, even if you wanted to issue bonds, nobody's willing to buy. Liquidity had absolutely gone to zero. I remember, like I've told you offline when we were discussing also, that was one of the single most scary moments I've seen ever since I read about 2008 crisis. For a brief second, it really looked like the end of the global banking system. For a brief second. What ended up happening? The Federal Reserve came in because it's the banker of last resort. They immediately bought $1 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds. So when going back to the earlier point, I said, why does the government own its own bonds? Because of events like this. So then suddenly, because people have the confidence that there is a backstop and that, so the Fed made a statement saying that we'll buy unlimited amount of bonds. You keep selling all day, we'll keep buying all day, was the statement. And that immediately restored confidence in this thing.
Is there a limit to how much of US debt the Fed can buy in an apocalypse?
In a very loose sense, there is some number. What is that number? Nobody knows. Because this is not a quantitative exercise where you apportion a number and say, here's the red line. So to make that even more concrete, I think in 2010 or 11, two economists, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, they're luminaries in the economic world. They published a paper saying that beyond 90% to debt to GDP, that's where the music ends. Turns out there was an Excel error, if I remember correctly, in the calculations. And there was another paper which kind of more or less corroborated what they said. But ever since, the debt has been continuously increasing. And here's the complicating factor. I don't think this train ends. Because if you think about going back to your primary story, which is essentially about green transition in one way or the other, in the next decade and a half or 2 decades, the world has to spend unlimited amounts of money moving away from fossil fuels. Right now, again, going back to a primary story about Germany, for the third time, Germany is buying guns. So the first 2 times it didn't really end well, but we are going. So Germany is rearming. So is the entire Europe. The US is literally forcing everybody to own up to their own security assurances, which means there's a ton of military spending coming into the economy. Third thing, the world is also aging, which means as people become older, there'll be pension obligations, social security, Medicare, food stamps, whatever. So the amount of spending that is yet to be done is more than the amount of spending which has been done, which means there is no conceivable reality where public debt can reduce. It is not a possibility. So the only way that happens is the government says, you're on your own, go eat fucking grass. We're not going to give you any money. We want to balance our budgets. So that's the reality where we are headed into. Going back to our earlier thing, what stops this baby? See, the entire world is directly hitched to the US. So US, again, 60% of central banking reserves are the dollar. Roughly 90% of global trade is invoiced in the dollar. I think half or 30 to 40%, I forget the number, of that entire foreign exchange swap market, etc. These are all esoteric instruments, are invoiced in the dollar. Dollar is literally tied into this thing. Which brings to the question, how did dollar become this thing? There are two answers. One is the book which you're reading, The Price of Time. There is a Bretton Woods conference. Dollar is crowned as the global reserve currency. I heard a counter argument from this person called Perry Merling saying that even before Bretton Woods conference, the world had more or less decided dollar is the only game in town. Which is to say that the dollar's dominance is not a result of US government pushing its policy saying that we want dollar to be the preeminent safe asset or reserve currency of the world. It is choices made by private sector actors. Because if you're a company and if you're transacting between two countries, in between the step where your money leaves your bank account, hits that other country, you need a safe place to hold this thing. And if you're in Namibia, you can't trust your own currency. If you're in Argentina, you bloody well as can't. What's the only safe asset? Dollar. So dollar is like a clearinghouse for intermediate payments. Second thing, your Apple. You literally have $150 billion of cash to $200 billion of cash. Where will you keep it? Indian bonds? Why would you trust India? Argentinian bonds? Why would you trust Argentina? You need a store of value to accommodate that value. You are Philippines, you are Thailand, you are Malaysia. You saw 1996, you had the Asian financial crisis. Your own currency is depreciated 50 to 80%. Now, next time you're worried that you can't let this happen. So you need to keep money for a rainy day. Where will you keep that money? So the dollar it's like a voodoo doll where all the pins have been stuck into the doll. So the moment you start unpicking the pins, this entire system falls apart. Is this a good system, bad system? I don't want to get into that. Because then you're making moralistic judgments about this. This is the system we have. This is a chimera that has evolved through the accident of history. What stopped this baby? Again, that Berkeley historian Barry Eichengreen wrote a nice piece a couple of weeks ago in the FT. Trump could be a factor. He destroys the confidence in dollar. He destroys the confidence in the global financial system so much that people will stop trusting the dollar. One way of visualizing this is ever since 2008 roughly, central banks have been buying an insane amount of gold to diversify with their reserve holdings. But that still leaves the question, there is no other asset which can accommodate that. Euro, nobody cares about euro. So after after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a brief period when euro had a lot of promise. But we know the monster that Europe has become today. Chinese renminbi, it's a heavily manipulated currency. And its current account is also not free. Indian rupee, cheap. Like we are a drop in the global bucket. Bitcoin, that was the promise. CBDCs, nobody knows. BRICS currency, again, like there are a lot of pipe dreams. But the simple matter of the fact is, US is the only game in town.
So basically, for anything to replace the US dollar, you'll have to have an equally messy, like evolutionary process.
Absolutely.
Over decades.
It's funny that you use the word evolution because so I was listening to this person called Perry Merling. He is at the Boston University. If I remember correctly, he's an economics professor. So he wrote this book called Money and Empire. So he uses the life of Charles Kindleberger, who wrote the books Panics, Manias, and Crashes. He's one of the most underrated people in this thing. So he's one of the more unknown architects of the global dollar system. So he uses Kindleberger's life to trace the evolution of dollar system. And he goes on to say that at every single point in time, there have been periodic shocks and the dollar system has only become stronger. It's like an organism which has evolved. So you had the First World War, the Federal Reserve is created. Immediately the sterling order collapses. So the US dollars the dollar system is forced into being something which it didn't really want to be. So when people say the dollar was crowned, nobody crowned it. It was forced into a role which it didn't want to play. After the collapse of World War II, then again dollar is in the system because the sterling definitively ends. You had the 1970s inflationary shock plus Nixon goes up the gold standard. The dollar is no longer backed by anything. But private actors still make a choice saying that this is better than going to Namibia. So even the dollar is literally not backed by anything. I mean, you can make hand-wavy statements that it's backed by the guns of US or the productive capacity of the US, the innovation of US. It's literally not backed by anything. But private actors still made a decision saying that this is this thing. And the mother of all shocks in 2008, that was supposed to be the definitive end of the dollar system. But the weird part is, as the US economy was collapsing, foreign investors were going and buying US bonds because that was a safe asset. If that doesn't scream irony. Like an economy is collapsing, you are worried about the safety of the economy collapsing. So you're buying the collapsing economy's bonds. So even after 2008, nothing really shocked. So the dollar system has been, to put your word, evolving around these constraints. Does this mean there's no end to this? Of course not. Like Trump could be one shock. The fact that this entire geopolitical fragmentation continues and every country, instead of being like a global market, start becoming islands, that's a real risk. So, and the third thing, like US technically could wake up one day and say, we are going to default on our debt. Not going to happen, but that's a reality. Fourth thing, they have that periodic debt ceiling drama where they put an arbitrary limit saying, this is the debt default. Beyond this, we'll default. And again, throughout my entire career of being conscious about the markets, this drama keeps happening every alternate year as I keep increasing the limits. So there's no stopping this baby.
Especially when the president and the Congress don't see eye to eye.
So that's my rabbit hole. I think this became a little messy because it's just...
This is a rabbit cave.
Yeah. Just, like, I still don't know more than what I know. But just reading this, the TLDR is, this thing is not as apocalyptic as people make it out to be. So there is an insane amount of nuance and there's an insane amount of context required about it.
So basically, if the US debt ever becomes a problem, the world is burning down anyway.
That's the last problem of ours. That means there's going to be fire and smoke outside our homes if that ever really happens. What's your next rabbit hole?
So my next rabbit hole is the blood oaths that created Chinese capitalism.
What are we talking about? A Kannada serial?
Almost.
Go on.
There is a story that we all have heard about China, which is that China is the economy that it is because it has strong leaders and, there's almost this sort of middle-aged uncle's fantasy about China where if you have a...
CCP is the conductor orchestrating the entirety of Chinese economy.
Absolutely. If you just have like one ballsy guy who tells everyone what to do. And I think a lot of people see that and want that power fantasy to play out in India. One guy can...
Elon Musk is cosplaying that right now as we speak.
Absolutely. So here's another story about how China rose, right? And that's a story about how the things that worked in China are the things that worked everywhere else. It was the resilience of the people in the face of the strong people trying to, push everyone around that actually led to its success. And the story begins in 1978.
Okay.
If you are like a Chinese person in 1978, you are traumatized.
Right.
The last 10 years have been the Cultural Revolution. Just before that, you had the Great Leap Forward. So basically, for the last 20 years, your life it's terrible. You have constant famine, constant drought. All institutions have burnt down. Millions of people have died. It's a tragedy worse than COVID, for instance. I mean, significantly worse than COVID. You're absolutely desperate, right? What the CCP has done under Mao it's said that we don't believe in private property.
Okay.
We don't think anybody should own land. We don't think anyone should own assets. So people are forced to till these like communal lands.
Dude, this sounds like a reality show.
An unfunded reality show. You build your own house and live with it.
It's more like build your own reality, but go on.
So you have this communal farming system where a lot of people are supposed to come together and randomly till just one huge patch of land. Yeah. You don't get any of the output.
So basically the government is telling what you need to do. You have absolutely no free will of your own.
It's like the entire country has been put on Narega.
Nice.
And that's the only job available.
Nice. Sounds Sounds very reasonable.
So there's this village called Xiaogang in Anhui province. It's a
Pretty
small...
sure you butchered the pronunciation, but yeah.
Absolutely. This is a place which has seemed like constant drought, and things have become absolutely desperate.
Right.
So there is this one patch of communal land. 18 farmers are supposed to till that same piece of land. And they're like, hey, I do not think this is working out at all.
Damn.
So they come together and they say, let's try out private property. Let's try out like your own ownership.
So this, to put it into context, China is still, it's not paradise, it's still a socialist hell.
This is that period of like where the world is suspended in the failure of communism. Like the communists came up with their ideas, they implemented them, and the failure is happening right now.
What came after was not there yet. It's still in that brief period.
Absolutely. So Mao died in 1976. Right? It's absolute chaos everywhere. Like nobody, there's a horrible leadership struggle that's happening. Deng is still besting his rivals. And these 18 farmers come together and they're like, this experiment does not seem to work. We can't tell that to anyone, but let's try out private. Let's pretend like we have private property, right? So we have this commune land that we are supposed to till. Let's break it down into 18 parts.
Okay.
And they all take a blood oath. They sign a contract and they sort of, with their blood.
Yeah. Talk about dramatic events.
All of them are sworn to secrecy, and the contract has one term, which is that if the CCP kills me, take care of my children.
Have to admire their loyalty.
So they just start pretending like they have private property, and the harvest that year is more than the combined harvest of the last 5 years.
So eventually, okay, what happens next?
So basically, they have quotas of like the produce that they have to give to the government.
Right.
They easily manage to sort of give that quota and have a lot for themselves, right? And because there has been so much chaos, the local party leaders are also sort of tired of, haranguing everyone. So they're like, fine, if you're giving me what I'm asking, then take whatever you want, right? And suddenly, like, that one village becomes prosperous. Apparently, per capita incomes jump by 20x.
Wow. That's nuts. And then it spreads elsewhere?
Yeah, so the example of this village, goes to other villages start trying the same thing.
Just like proper network effects.
Absolutely. So basically the same system starts flooding like all the villages around Xiaogang, and like eventually it reaches Beijing.
Okay.
If it had reached Beijing 5 years ago, these guys would have just been shot, and then everyone would have gone back to the old system.
Unpeaceful deaths. Right.
But it reaches Deng Xiaoping.
Okay.
And Deng Xiaoping is the kind of guy that doesn't care.
Right.
Deng Xiaoping is the guy who's famous for saying, I don't care if a cat is white or black as it catches mice. I don't care if you call it communism, capitalism, let's get rich first.
Very practical.
So, not only does Deng sort of turn a blind eye to this, when Deng has to make sort of political speeches, just impress upon his new reform agenda to anyone, this becomes a shining example of what the Chinese people can do if they're just allowed to have some private property. So now, like, in the villages of China, the old commune system has started to break down. By 1983, I think they start phasing it out as well. Deng is also starting
His reforms.
He's starting his reforms, but at that point, the reforms are actually very limited.
Right.
What he basically does is that at the beginning, he's opened some SEZs near the coast, and there you have sort of almost capitalist-like production, but everywhere else you're on the old system and you're like, hey, let's preserve the old system.
Yeah.
So there are some provinces in China that get these SEZs.
Okay.
Right? There are some other provinces that have PSUs. Right? But it isn't as though there is no economic activity anywhere else in China.
Okay.
Right? So for instance, take the, I'll again butcher the pronunciation, but it's called, I think, Zhejiang province.
I'll pretend like I can say that, but go ahead.
So in Zhejiang province, they neither get an SEZ nor do they get a PSU, right? But they have the precedent of Zhaogang and their sort of faux capitalist reforms, right? And that sort of sparks an idea like, hey, we can do similar stuff for other things.
Who's who in this case?
So what starts happening in Zhejiang is that you have this explosion of town and village enterprises. And this happens across China, but Zhejiang is one of the places that takes this up the most enthusiastically. So basically, in villages and towns, people start setting up businesses. And these are small businesses. These are business for cement, bricks, whatever, like the things that people would need nearby.
Makes sense.
But they say that this is the communal business of this village. They have tie-ups with the party functionaries that, hey, you turn a blind eye, let me run this business. We will say this is our village's business, but it's not really that.
It's actually quite cool.
So, I mean, everyone thinks of China as this, brutalized state where everyone follows the dear leader. But one of the most famous sort of Chinese quotes out there is that the heavens are high and the emperor is far. It's basically that, hey,
Because it's such a massive landmass.
if you want to break a law, the two guys will stop you, your king and your god.
Yeah, they're pretty nearby. 5 minutes away. So, and then what's the conclusion? Like, so this gets adopted as the model by the guys in power? Like Beijing puts its stamp of approval?
So let me sort of build that story out, right? So TVs sort of crop up all across China. In Zhejiang province, they are extremely enthusiastic about them, right? These lead to a wave of industrialization out across China. Now, these are not like sort of heavy industries. This isn't, manufacturing steel. But even a brick kiln, even like basic stuff, right? You have this wave of commercial activity that goes across China.
So this is happening in the context of Deng's reforms also. Because if I remember correctly, it starts in 79 or 89.
Yeah, 79 is the third plenum where Deng sort of initiates the reforms. But the reforms are building up slowly and the official reforms are happening in a place like Shenzhen, for instance.
Achha. So these are still limited to the larger centers.
Absolutely. But the TVEs are this organic sort of bottom-up evolution that's happening everywhere else.
So this is without either the blessing or the obstruction of the people in power.
At least at the top. It is with the blessing of
Forget the local
functionaries.
functionaries, yeah.
So then you have private like you're allowed to start private corporations later. There is a wave of reforms. And a lot of those TVs become companies in China, right? So there is this repeated story that plays out in China where, because it is such a decentralized system, because there is so much power that is at the ground level, you basically get many, many rolls of the dice.
Yeah.
That's what happened in Zhaogang. That was basically every village had a dice that they could roll. Zhaogang got whatever, double sixes. They became an economy, and then every village around said, hey, we could do this. Right? That happens at the local level, that happens at the provincial level, that happens everywhere. Right? So Zhejiang, so basically what China ends up having is that every province basically has a different flavor of their capitalism communism mix.
So it's like a Cambrian explosion at every province all at the same time.
Every province. Everyone's trying their own stuff. Some people are just doing their brutalist, oppressive stuff. But some provinces are almost capitalist in nature. Zhejiang is one of them. So I'll tell you so Zhejiang is apparently one of the most vibrant provinces in China in terms of the economy. There are richer provinces. It's I think the fifth richest.
So this is at that point, not today.
Today. Right. That culture of TVs becomes a culture of companies, which becomes like this vibrant economic culture.
Interesting. Right? Okay.
This is the province from which Alibaba comes out.
Ooh, interesting.
This is the province from which DeepSeek comes out. This is the province from where the 6 little dragons of China have come out. So basically companies doing all the cool Chinese companies. companies that are doing like gaming, AI, robotics, like all of those companies all come out from this province. And the history of this province lies in like those tiny little town and village enterprises where its officials were the most willing to look away when its people were doing business. So if you want to replicate DeepSeek, one way of doing it is that we will buy lots of chips and do a central government data center. Another way of doing it is to say, let your guys do what they want. We'll figure it out.
This reminds me of that I've told you also that, 1 second, that Yuan Ang. So she wrote that book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. She's I think some econ professor at Johns Hopkins. So she said the exact same thing. Most people make the mistake of assuming China is this brutalist top-down dictatorship where somebody waves a wand and people automatically follow like sheep and then, party directions get implemented. Nothing could be further from the truth. China is basically like a cluster of decentralized mini towns and cities who are all, they know the spirit of what's the direction from the top. They implemented it in their own this thing. And she said that like in that unstable period of, like as Deng was getting into this thing, these people were experimenting so much and doing things on their own. And the success is as a direct result of that rather than from the, magic and supposed foresight of the Chinese this thing. She also made an interesting point about corruption. In India, we are known for petty corruption. You can literally pay 10 rupees, 100 rupees, it doesn't really matter. But when Chinese guys do corruption, they go big. They go big or they don't. So petty corruption doesn't really hinder the formation of enterprises or doing business or whatever. It's either I'm gonna kill you and your 5 extended generations of family, or I leave you alone. We are good. So that sort of that accepted corruption in only the larger scale has also ensured that tiny enterprises they're not stifled by the local party. This thing that really blew my mind. So I bought the book. I haven't yet read it.
I think one thing that's important is that their sort of like government functionaries' pays are tied to their economic success.
Oh yeah. So that's she also said that like it's you are literally gaming your performance in a good way. So you have to show results, which means you will end up gaming the numbers, but at least there's a tangible outcome to it. Unlike our own municipalities or our own cities and towns, there's absolutely nothing. And not that they have enough power also.
But the only route to wealth is corruption.
Yeah. But I think it's easy to take that point of the logical extension, saying that everything is corrupt. I don't know enough Chinese history to say, but if I were, based on whatever limited reading I have done, I don't know if that's the case. Because if that was the case, I think there would be a lot more sand in the gears of the Chinese economy.
I didn't get what you...
No, in the sense that the only route is corruption for local party guys.
No, I'm talking about India. India, the gears are submerged in sand.
We don't have gears. It's so corrupt that the gears have been sold for scrap. So it's this thing.
So what happens is that basically 51% of spending is at the local level, right? So that basically means that the guy who's taking the spending decision is the guy who lives down the road, right? That guy's own pay is linked to how much economic success your district is seeing. His government's revenues are linked to sort of being able to, create private enterprise. So they've just gotten the incentive game much better than India has. I think if we want any sort of long-term success, we also need a lot more sort of devolution.
Absolutely. The other point she made that, in a way, it's almost like Chinese cities, towns, it's like Hunger Games. So every town is pitted against the other. They're literally competing with the neighboring city and not really against some other country. So one town or province has, let's say, the best EV, this thing. The other town, by sheer force, is almost forced to create conditions so that they have a competitor at their local side. Because, like you rightly said, the people in power in those local provinces, their pay is tied to the economic output they generate. Like if you think, like the Chinese government, Shao, he is the HR. He creates performance points for the local town officials, and they'll do anything to ensure they meet the target. And the fact that,
Except unlike the Hunger Games where only one person wins, right? In China, you'll have a period of poverty, then you're like, let's do what that guy is doing. So you have a lot of good policy evolving bottom up.
Hunger Games with positive externalities.
What's your...
Okay, one second. I keep forgetting his name. Mine is also again the second rabbit hole is China. So I don't think I seem to have developed this weird fascination. So I read this article in Foreign Affairs magazine from this person called Michael Froman. He's the president of Council of Foreign Affairs. It's one of those US think tanks. I don't know what their ideology is. Maybe centerish. They're pretty pro-establishment, etc. So the article title is also funny. He wrote this article recently called China has remade the international system. And subtext is how the world adopted Beijing's economic playbook. So the point is, one of the underappreciated way China became China is they forced foreign companies to set up joint ventures in the local, towns and provinces, and also transfer technology to the local district. So Volkswagen, Mercedes, etc., they were forced being the operative word, to transfer technology. And at the heart of all these complaints, when people say China stole technology, this is what they mean to a limited extent. Not that there is no spying or whatever, but that's a common thing throughout history. US has stolen technology from UK, so on and so forth, but let's not get into that. And what ended up happening is, so when these companies were forced to transfer the technology, so the local workforces in all those towns and provinces were trained by local people who actually understood the technology of the Western companies. And then as innovation diffuses, China's workforce actually became much, much better than they otherwise would have been. So this is really key to it. And later, as the payoffs from innovation increased, China became this industrial conglomerate that we all came to know to be. Now, apparently, there is talk in Western countries saying that we have to do to China what China did to us, which is we need to force BYD to come set up a plant in Dallas or Detroit or whatever. Ask BYD to set up a local US-China joint venture, force BYD to transfer technology, train local white people to know how to make EV companies. Because right now, neither Europe nor US companies, even Tesla for that matter, they're not competitive to the extent of, let's say, Xiaomi's cars or BYD's. They're far, far behind. BYD is just literally killing it. Like we recently saw that hypercharger or whatever. So now there is talk that do unto China what China did unto us. So this has become the policy. Like apparently, I was listening to this podcast by Adam Tooze, the historian. He said that the German guys are not in pretending at this point, it seems. Like if you get them drunk, the representatives will say that, no, we have to just do, why don't we do what China did to us? Like openly saying it out loud, saying that let's do what they're doing. If you think about just...
Do you think that would work though?
See, there's clearly some success cases. So for example, from whatever little I know, TSMC was forced to set up a plant in Arizona. TSMC was forced to hire, as part of its condition to set up a plant, was forced to hire white people. So initially, they ran into a lot of problems in terms of generating yields from those fabs, etc. But now they are saying that we are almost hitting the 70 to 80% yield in terms of producing chips using local American labor. And we're talking about semiconductor labor. And this is as high-end as it gets. The same applies to India also. So Foxconn, when it was setting up its plant in Tamil Nadu, I think Chennai or somewhere, apparently, when they were assembling those iPhones, the older end iPhones, the rejection rates were as high as 1 in 2 iPhones were defective. I'm just talking about assembly. So, but then, by the way, in both the case of TSMC and Foxconn, they apparently shuttled their employees from Taiwan, trained the local guys.
Even from China.
Yeah. So, you could make the case that it works. And if you assume that China has become such a massive industrial powerhouse, and it only happened because there is a reasonable degree of training the workforce. And China pretty much comes from the same starting point as India, both in terms of the skill availability, both in terms of the size of the workforce, both in terms of more or less the starting conditions. Set aside the political differences. So I would argue, I think it would work. But at the same time, the difference between China and the West is China was focused. So it was a matter of survival for them. It was a matter of getting over their national shame or whatever. Like in a way, it was a singular focus for them. But with West, I'm a little skeptical. So adjusted for that, I would say that there might be a reasonable number of success cases. But could you replicate China's model like for like in, let's say Germany and US?
So just to understand, right, like, what are the innovations that people want from China? Is it just a few technical innovations? Because I mean, EVs, all these technologies came up in the Western world.
Yeah. But so the thing with China is everything came from the West, but China took that and proceeded further.
So the process innovations, is it like technology? What is
So it's all. So in the case of BYD, it's not just the fact that it is EVs, because even US can make EVs. But BYD does it at such scale. BYD does it. There's also the labor advantage, obvious, which goes without saying. But BYD does it at such scale using such cutting edge technology, like be it in terms of automation, be it in terms of usage of robotics inside factories. It is able to extract more value per car than the US company. So at the like a way of visualizing it is there are more people involved in manufacturing Teslas than a BYD. So they've gone to the frontier more than the US companies. The same applies to, in a way, chips. Like, what's the difference between TSMC's 2 nanometer chips and Huawei's 7 nanometer chips? It's just that they've managed to, using the constraints that they've had, they have figured out ways to get to where the other, let's say, the cutting edge players are using their thing. So in a way, it's just the question of restarting that technological innovation process, which the US was good at, and they paused. So they gave up. Like, I remember recently I read how Japan became the chip powerhouse. So they used a technology which the US had given up on, and they also created conditions just like the Chinese did in terms of fusing the political machinery with the industrial machinery, ensuring there are no barriers, like giving whatever the industry wants, and ensuring that they outproduce Intel, they outproduce Texas Instruments, etc. So in a span of, let's say, 5 to 10 years, Japan became a chip powerhouse when the US was the leading, and we're talking about old chips. These are 30, 40 nanometer chips. Today, it seems anachronistic to even talk about it. So I think there is an element of politics, but there's an element of labor. There's an element of that R&D ecosystem because I think that is China's biggest thing. They've tightly coupled all these industries in one way, that diffusion in one industry. This person called Kyle Chan, which we also read regularly, he had made a nice network diagram. So one advancement in one industry leads to spillover effects on the other industry, and it's become a virtuous cycle where nothing is really disconnected. And I mean, you have to, like, you can hate the Chinese political system, the repression or whatever, but in terms of creating an ecosystem for innovation and lifting people out of their otherwise miserable circumstances, like they've nailed it. I think everybody can learn from that.
To go back to that Zhejiang thing that I was talking about, apparently it's a nanny state in a different flavor. So it's a nanny state for businesses, in that if there is anything at all that businesses require from the government, they're apparently like extremely high customer service in that sense. They will tend to your every need and just go like, okay, we will create the conditions for you, just do business. It's almost like it's like if Gujarat was an extremely decentralized sort of.
Right. It's true. Like, I mean, that applies in Tamil Nadu also. It's the same thing. Like, you come to us, because that chief minister was in New York or wherever, he was asking the US guys to come set up plant. And I have relatives in Tamil Nadu and I see it. Like, you tell us what you want, we'll make it happen. You want uninterrupted power? Done. Land acquisition? Done.
The problem is that your labor laws, your environmental laws, all of those are central legislations that, there are real constraints that.
Agreed. But I'm saying these are not insurmountable problems. In today's world, the insurmountable problems are you not having, let's say, a university education system that produces high quality talent. You not having industrial ecosystems that allow you to do R&D. But when it comes to passing laws or this thing, those are the easy low-hanging fruit to get rid of, in a very loose and hand-wavy sense. But it's just a question of, do we want to is the... But having said that, just one limited rabbit hole, in a world where the US is forcing every country to go at it alone, in a world where people have realized that entire, it was not BS, but aberration in history, saying that, we are all one happy family globally. Now that is shattering, and now that the delusion is shattering, and countries are being forced to, reshore, onshore, whatever word you want to use. I think all these elements that we have spoken about in isolation, the innovation clusters, the lack of skilled talent, research ecosystem, everything, I think countries will be forced to create it more. Because now you can't rely on the largest of Uncle Sam anymore. So that person wants to go at it alone, which means it's now on you to create. Like, in a way, every country has to start from scratch to chart its own destiny. It's a very weird and unstable world at the same time, but at the same time,
maybe having a sclerotic economy is not that bad a thing because
there's no downside. There's no downside. It's all up. Okay. So, this is fun. I think it's still rougher on the edges, but we'll get to it. But I had fun recording it. So.
We are clearly not trained media people. We are clearly nerds on a rampage.
Yep. So I think there's a lot of rambling. We'll cut all that. But I think this is much better than our previous attempts, the limited roundtables or whatever we did. So yeah, so you guys saw this. Let us know what you think. Do keep in mind we have very, very low self-esteem. So unless you want to see videos from two grown adults crying, saying that you guys didn't like our videos, please say positive stuff in the comments. So thank you so much for watching this. So you let us know what's the good, what's the bad. We'll change it. But the reason, at least for my reason of doing this was, see, nobody pretends, so everybody wants to pretend like an expert. And I think that's a bad thing for a lot of people, especially when you're learning. I think you should be comfortable looking like an idiot and share that process of learning with the people. At least that was my incentive for being here. So I don't claim to know, I'm not an expert on US debt.
And revel on the fascination of just the world because it's beautiful.
So, I mean, this is all the more incentive for me to go down more rabbit holes. So this is deeply selfish. I mean, in a way, I could give a beep that whether you like the video or not. But having said that, I want, it's going down more rabbit holes is fun. More people should go tumbling down rabbit holes and just fall on their face in different ways they otherwise wouldn't have imagined. So if we can showcase this to you and you are inspired to go down rabbit holes, I consider that as a win.